In the Valley of the Kings, there's a wall that has been scanned more times than almost any surface on Earth. Laser scanners have mapped it down to the width of a single brushstroke. Ground-penetrating radar has been fired through it 3 separate times by 3 different teams from 3 different countries. And after all of that data, all those years, and all that money, archaeologists still cannot fully agree on one simple question. Is there empty space behind that wall, or is it solid rock? This is the tomb of Tutankhamun, and the scans done inside it since 2015 have turned one of the most thoroughly examined burial sites in human history into one of its most contested. The tomb was found in November 1922 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter, working under the funding of Lord Carnarvon. After years of searching the Valley of the Kings near Luxor, Carter's team uncovered a stairway buried beneath the remains of ancient workmen's huts. It led down to a sealed doorway stamped with Royal Necropolis seals. When Carter finally broke through and lowered a candle into the darkness, he described seeing the glint of gold everywhere, famously answering Carnarvon's question of what he could see with the words, "wonderful things." Inside were more than 5,000 objects, gilded shrines, a solid gold funerary mask, chariots, weapons, jewelry, and the mummified body of a young king who had died more than 3,000 years earlier. It remains the only royal tomb from ancient Egypt ever found nearly intact, and it turned Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh who ruled for less than a decade, into the most famous name in Egyptology. The discovery made headlines across the world within days, and the sheer volume of objects meant that Carter and his team, working with conservators and photographers, including Harry Burton, spent almost 10 years documenting, conserving, and removing everything from the tomb before it was considered fully cleared. Every item, from the golden mask to the smallest bead, was numbered, photographed in place, and recorded in a card system that is still used by researchers today, more than a century later, to study the collection, now housed primarily in the Grand Egyptian Museum near Cairo. But almost from the beginning, one detail bothered researchers who studied the tomb closely. Tutankhamun ruled during the 18th dynasty, a period when pharaohs were buried in enormous multi-chambered tombs cut deep into the limestone hills, with long descending corridors, pillared halls, and side rooms built to hold the vast quantities of goods a king was expected to carry into the afterlife. Tutankhamun's tomb, designated KV62 in the standard numbering system for the Valley of the Kings, is nothing like that. It consists of 4 small rooms, and its total footprint is a fraction of the size of the tombs built for kings who came before and after him. For decades, the standard explanation was straightforward. Tutankhamun died unexpectedly around the age of 19, likely before a larger royal tomb could be finished, so his burial party used a smaller, existing space instead, possibly one originally intended for a nobleman or official rather than a king. By comparison, the tomb of his grandfather, Amenhotep III, and the later tomb built for Ramesses II stretched for well over 100 meters into the hillside, with multiple pillared halls, side chambers for storage, and long ceremonial corridors meant to mirror the journey of the sun god through the underworld. KV62, by contrast, could fit inside the entrance corridor of either of those tombs, which is part of why its scale struck early excavators as odd, even before anyone raised the question of hidden rooms. That explanation held for nearly a century, until a British Egyptologist named Nicholas Reeves, a specialist affiliated at the time with the University of Arizona, took a much closer look at high-resolution scans of the tomb's painted walls. These scans were not ordinary photographs. They had been produced years earlier by the Madrid-based conservation company Factum Arte, which had used precision laser scanning to record the surface of the burial chamber in extraordinary detail, originally as part of an effort to create an exact facsimile of the tomb for tourists to visit instead of the fragile original. Reeves was studying these scans in 2015 when he noticed something in the plaster of the north and west walls. Beneath the painted scenes, he could make out faint, linear traces, subtle enough that they were invisible to the naked eye in the actual tomb, but clearly visible in the scan data. To Reeves, these lines were consistent with the outlines of 2 blocked and plastered over doorways. Reeves published his theory in the summer of 2015, and it was bold. He proposed that KV62 was never built as a tomb for Tutankhamun at all. Instead, he argued, it began as the outer corridor of a much larger tomb built for someone else, most likely Queen Nefertiti, the chief wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten and possibly Tutankhamun's stepmother, whose burial place has never been conclusively identified. According to Reeves' theory, when the young king died suddenly, his funeral planners partitioned off the front section of Nefertiti's unfinished or already sealed tomb, plastered up the connecting doorways, and used that space for Tutankhamun's burial, leaving what he believed could be Nefertiti's undisturbed burial chamber sealed behind the north wall. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities took the theory seriously enough to test it directly. In November 2015, the Japanese ground-penetrating radar specialist Hirokazu Watanabe was brought in to scan the walls Reeves had identified. Before the radar survey, an initial thermal imaging scan had already picked up a variation in surface temperature on part of the north wall, which researchers noted could be consistent with a void behind it, though temperature differences can also result from many other causes, including differences in plaster thickness or moisture. Watanabe's radar readings followed, and at a press conference in Cairo, the then Minister of Antiquities, Mamdouh El-Damadi, probability of roughly 90% that there was empty space behind both the north and west walls, and that the radar signal was consistent with the presence of both metal and organic material inside those spaces. The announcement was reported around the world as a possible confirmation that a hidden chamber, and perhaps the long-lost burial of Nefertiti herself, was sitting just a few feet from where tourists photographed the golden funerary scenes every day. The excitement did not last. A second radar investigation was carried out in 2016, this time by a team working with National Geographic and Egyptian antiquities officials. Their results did not match Watanabe's. The second survey found no clear evidence of a witnessed hidden void behind either wall, and researchers involved described the data as inconclusive at best, noting that the radar signatures Watanabe had interpreted as chamber boundaries could plausibly be explained by natural variations in the limestone bedrock, which is known to contain fractures, mineral banding, and pockets of differing density that can scatter or reflect radar signals in ways that mimic the appearance of an artificial void without one actually being present. The two surveys, conducted on the same walls within a year of each other, using the same general technology, had produced contradictory conclusions, and the raw data from Watanabe's original scan was never released in a form that allowed independent specialists to fully verify his interpretation. That left the Ministry of Antiquities with an unresolved and increasingly public scientific dispute, sitting inside the most famous archaeological site in the country. To settle the matter, Egyptian authorities commissioned a third and far more rigorous investigation. In February 2018, a team led by the geophysicist Franco Porcelli from the Polytechnic University of Turin, working with Egyptian researchers, conducted an extensive ground-penetrating radar survey of the burial chamber, using 3 separate radar systems operating across a wide range of frequencies, from 150 MHz up to 3,000 MHz, along with dense spatial sampling designed to catch subtle variations that earlier surveys might have missed. This was, by design, meant to be the most thorough and technically sound of the 3 investigations. The results were presented in May 2018 at a conference at the Grand Egyptian Museum, and they were unambiguous. The Turin team reported, in their own words, a very high level of confidence that the hypothesis of hidden chambers or corridors adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb was not supported by the radar data. Unlike the earlier surveys, this study was also published in full in a peer-reviewed academic journal, the Journal of Cultural Heritage, in 2019, making the underlying methodology and data available for other specialists to examine and critique. So where does that leave the mystery? On the strict physical evidence, the most rigorous and most thoroughly documented of the 3 scans found nothing. No voids, no corridors, no discontinuities in the radar signal consistent with a hollow space and an artificial blocking wall. If you're looking for a purely scientific verdict on whether there is a hidden chamber physically waiting behind the north wall of KV62 right now, the best available data says no. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities and the broader Egyptological community have largely treated the 2018 Turin survey as the closing word on the radar question. And unlike the earlier controversy over unpublished data, that closing word is documented in the scientific literature for anyone to check. But that is not quite the end of the story, because the radar findings never fully explained the thing that started this entire investigation in the first place, which was Nicholas Reeves' original observation of linear features in the Factum Arte laser scans. Radar detects density differences and voids behind a surface. It does not, on its own, explain why. Certain lines appear embedded in the plaster itself, nor does it settle every question art historians have raised about the tomb's layout and decoration. Reeves and other researchers have pointed to details beyond the scan lines that they argue are still worth taking seriously, even if the hidden Nefertiti chamber theory specifically has lost most of its scientific support. One of those details involves the tomb's orientation. In Egyptian royal tombs of this general period, there was a loose but recognizable pattern in which the entrance corridor of a king's tomb tended to bend to the left, while tombs built for queens tended to bend to the right. KV62 turns to the right, which is unusual for a king's tomb, and which Reeves has cited as one reason to think the space might originally have been designed for a royal woman before being adapted for Tutankhamun's burial. This is a real and documented architectural anomaly, though it is worth being cautious here, because the pattern is not an absolute rule across every tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and a right-turning corridor by itself is not proof of anything. It is a piece of circumstantial evidence, not a verdict. A second detail involves the artwork on the north wall itself. That wall shows 3 painted scenes, and in one of them, the mummified Tutankhamun is shown undergoing the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual meant to magically restore his senses so he could eat, speak, and see in the afterlife. The person performing that ritual is shown wearing the regalia of a pharaoh, an Egyptological tradition and textual. Precedent generally held that this ritual, in royal succession scenes, was performed by the reigning king for his dead predecessor. The figure performing the ceremony for Tutankhamun is understood by mainstream Egyptology to represent I, the elderly official who succeeded Tutankhamun as pharaoh after his death. Reeves has argued that the proportions and facial features of some figures on this wall show signs of having been reworked from an earlier design, suggesting the scene may originally have been carved or planned with different figures in mind before being adapted for Tutankhamun's funeral. This claim is more debated than the radar findings. Repainting and adjustment of royal tomb decoration was not unusual in this period for political and religious reasons, unrelated to any hidden burial, and most Egyptologists who have examined the wall in detail have not endorsed Reeves' specific reading of altered faces as evidence of an earlier, different owner. A third point concerns the plasterwork itself. Some researchers, including Reeves, have noted that the north and west walls of the burial chamber show construction and finishing techniques that differ somewhat from the walls in the rest of the tomb, which they argue is consistent with those walls, having been added or modified rather than being original, uninterrupted rock face. Critics of this interpretation point out that KV-62 was, by any measure, an unusually rushed burial, hurriedly adapted from a smaller pre-existing space, and that inconsistent plasterwork is exactly what you would expect from workmen racing to finish a royal funeral on a tight timeline, with no need to invoke a second, hidden tomb behind it. Taken together, these 3 observations, the tomb's orientation, the reworked wall scene, and the uneven plaster, form the circumstantial backbone of Reeves's broader argument that KV-62 began its life as something other than a purpose-built tomb for Tutankhamun. Even researchers who are skeptical of the specific Nefertiti hidden chamber theory generally accept that the tomb shows signs of being adapted from an earlier or different intended use, given its unusually small size for a king of this dynasty and its layout, which resembles private and secondary royal tombs more than the grand descending corridors used for other 18th dynasty pharaohs like Amenhotep III or Ramesses II. Where scholars diverge sharply is on the next step, whether that adaptation involved sealing off inhabited, still undiscovered chambers containing another burial, or whether it simply meant reusing an existing small tomb and finishing it in a hurry with no further rooms behind the walls at all. It is also worth being clear about what the 2018 Turin survey did and did not rule out. The scan focused specifically on testing for voids immediately adjacent to the burial chamber's north and west walls, the exact area Reeves had proposed based on the Factum Arte scan lines. Its conclusion that there is no evidence of hidden chambers or corridors adjacent to the tomb in that location is a strong and well-documented result. It does not, and was never intended to, rule out the broader question of where Nefertiti herself might actually be buried, since her tomb, wherever it is, remains one of the significant unsolved mysteries of Egyptology, regardless of what is or is not behind Tutankhamun's walls. The Turin conclusion closed one specific hypothesis about one specific location. It did not close the search for Nefertiti's tomb as a whole. Nicholas Reeves, for his part, has not fully abandoned his interpretation of the original laser scan evidence, even as he has acknowledged that the radar results complicate his hypothesis. He has pointed out that ground-penetrating radar can behave unpredictably in limestone environments, where natural fractures, geological banding, and variations in rock density can produce results that are difficult to interpret with total certainty, and that a negative radar result in a geologically complex site is not always as conclusive as a positive one would be. Most of the geophysicists involved in the Turin survey have pushed back on this framing, noting that their study was specifically designed with multiple frequencies and dense sampling in order to account for exactly these kinds of natural interference patterns, and that their peer-reviewed conclusion reflects that added scrutiny. What nobody disputes is the sheer strangeness of Tutankhamun's tomb when placed next to the burial complexes of the kings around him. He inherited a throne as a child, likely around the age of 9, following the chaotic and short religiously revolutionary reign of his father, Akhenaten, who had attempted to reorient Egyptian religion around the worship of a single sun-disk deity called the Aten. Tutankhamun's own reign, guided in its early years by powerful advisors, oversaw a restoration of a traditional Egyptian religious practice, and he died still a teenager, with a body that shows evidence of physical ailments, including a badly broken leg near the time of death and evidence of malaria. Infection, either of which, or a combination of both, may have contributed to his death. modern CT scans and DNA studies conducted on his mummy in the 2000s and 2010s have added considerable detail to what is known about his health and lineage, confirming that his parents were closely related siblings or half-siblings, likely Akhenaten and one of his sisters, which researchers believe contributed to a range of congenital conditions evident in his skeleton. Because his death came without long warning, there was almost certainly no time to complete a tomb on the scale normally reserved for a king. Egyptian royal tombs were typically begun early in a pharaoh's reign and expanded over years or even decades. So a king who died young and unexpectedly regularly ended up in a smaller or repurposed space, a pattern seen elsewhere in Egyptian history as well. This is the least controversial and most broadly accepted explanation for why KV62 is so cramped, and it does not require any hidden chamber theory to make sense on its own. A similar pattern shows up elsewhere in the Valley of the Kings. Several tombs belonging to kings who reigned only briefly or who died before their planned burial place was finished show comparable signs of hurried construction, unfinished decoration in the deeper chambers, or reuse of space originally cut for someone else, which suggests that whatever happened with Tutankhamun's burial, it was not without precedent in Egyptian funerary practice of the period. What Reeves and later researchers added to that picture was not a rejection of the rushed burial explanation, but a more specific proposal about exactly which existing space was repurposed, and why its layout and decoration carry traces that do not perfectly match a burial planned from the start for a king. The unresolved tension in all of this comes down to a mismatch between two kinds of evidence that measure different things. The laser scan evidence that started the entire debate is a record of the visible and near-surface characteristics of the plaster and painted wall, the kind of subtle physical trace an artist or mason might leave behind when reworking a surface. The radar evidence measures something different, the density and structure of the material behind that surface, down to a significant depth into the rock. It is entirely possible, and this is the interpretation increasingly favored by mainstream Egyptology, for both sets of observations to be independently accurate. The wall may show genuine signs of having been altered or adapted during a rushed royal burial without there being any intact, hollow chamber sitting behind it today. Adaptation does not require an empty room. A doorway can be filled in solidly with rubble and plaster rather than leading to open space, which would still leave the physical trace Reeves detected on the surface, while producing exactly the kind of solid, undifferentiated radar signal the Turin team recorded. As of the most recent published findings, this is where the science actually stands. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities and the Supreme Council of Antiquities have treated the 2018 Turin survey and its full 2019 publication as the definitive answer to the specific question of hidden chambers behind the walls of KV62, and no further radar investigation of the tomb has been announced since. The scientific record does not currently support the existence of intact hidden chambers holding a burial behind Tutankhamun's tomb. What the record does support is that the tomb's unusual proportions, its right-turning corridor, and some anomalies in its wall decoration remain genuinely debated details of Egyptian funerary archaeology worth continued study, even if the most dramatic version of the theory, a fully intact, undisturbed burial chamber of Queen Nefertiti sitting 3 feet from the tourists photographing the north wall, is not supported by the best evidence currently available. The location of Nefertiti's actual tomb remains one of the true open questions in Egyptology. She disappears from the historical record after roughly the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, and no confirmed burial site or mummy has ever been definitively identified as hers, despite several competing candidate identifications proposed over the decades for mummies found in other tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Some researchers have proposed that Nefertiti may in fact already be among the unidentified mummies recovered from a nearby cache tomb, KV21, or the side chamber of KV35. Though DNA and forensic analysis on those remains has so far been inconclusive or contested, and no identification has achieved the kind of broad scholarly consensus that would settle the question. Her tomb's location, whatever it eventually turns out to be, remains unresolved, and that unresolved question is likely part of why the Tutankhamun hidden chamber theory captured public imagination as powerfully as it did. It offered the tantalizing possibility that 2 of ancient Egypt's greatest unanswered questions, the smallness of Tutankhamun's tomb and the missing burial of Nefertiti, might have a single connected answer. The radar evidence available today does not support that connection, at least not in the specific location Reeves proposed, but it has not closed the far broader search for where Nefertiti actually rests. What the KV62 investigations do demonstrate clearly is how much modern imaging technology has changed archaeology's relationship with sites that were physically excavated and documented nearly a century ago. Howard Carter's team spent roughly a decade clearing and cataloging the tomb's contents after 1922, working almost entirely with visual inspection, photography, and hand-drawn records, the standard tools of the era. It took nearly 100 years and a completely different set of technologies, laser surface scanning originally built for museum conservation, and ground-penetrating radar borrowed from geology and construction engineering, to raise a serious new question about a tomb that generations of archaeologists had already walked through, measured, and documented in detail. That is arguably the most significant lasting outcome of this entire episode, independent of whether Nefertiti is or is not sitting behind that wall. It is a demonstration that even the most famous, most examined archaeological site on the planet can still be re-examined through new technology and yield a legitimate, published, peer-reviewed scientific debate. The same combination of tools used at KV-62, high-resolution laser and photogrammetric scanning, paired with ground-penetrating radar, has since been applied to other sites across Egypt and beyond, from searching for undiscovered chambers near the Great Pyramid of Giza to mapping buried structures at sites in Italy, Turkey, and Central America. In most of these cases, the technology has been used the same way it eventually was at Tutankhamun's tomb, not to hand. Archaeologists an instant discovery, but to narrow down where a small, targeted excavation or a non-invasive follow-up survey might be worth the time, cost, and risk to a fragile site. Radar and laser scanning are tools for generating better questions and testable hypotheses, not machines that produce final answers on their own, and the KV-62 investigation is now one of the most well-documented examples of exactly how that process is supposed to work. Disagreement, follow-up testing, and all. For now, the north wall of the burial chamber remains exactly as it has been for more than 3,000 years, painted with the golden figures of the gods and officials guiding Tutankhamun into the afterlife, viewed by a steady stream of visitors who mostly have no idea that the scenes in front of them once sat at the center of an international scientific dispute involving 3 separate radar surveys, a peer-reviewed geophysics journal, and one of the most famous missing figures in ancient history. Whatever else remains uncertain about Tutankhamun's tomb, the evidence gathered so far tells a genuinely fascinating story on its own, about a teenage king buried in a hurry in a space that may never have been meant for him, decorated with a scene that scholars are still arguing over, sealed inside walls that modern science has now examined more closely than any tomb wall in history, and largely, though perhaps not completely, come away with an answer. If you want to keep exploring the science behind ancient Egypt's biggest unsolved mysteries, subscribe to this channel because there's a lot more of this story still to uncover.